You have watched that opening 100 times. The paint filter, the wooden hull of a boat dropping a square peg into the sea, and that little island sitting on the horizon. 3 palm trees on a scrap of sand. You think you know what you are looking at. You think it is just a transition, a nautical gag to set the mood for a cartoon about a sponge. But what if that island is not just an island? What if that specific stretch of water, and that specific name, drag the entire show into the shadow of the most destructive weapons ever built? What if the reason a sponge walks and talks is the same reason the water around him glows? SpongeBob SquarePants premiered in 1999, created by Steven Hillenburg for Nickelodeon. Hillenburg was a marine biologist who originally conceived the characters for an educational comic book called The Intertidal Zone. Nickelodeon was transitioning out of its early era of slower, more literary shows and pushing for high-energy, gag-driven animation to compete in the cable landscape. The network needed shows that could move merchandise and hold the attention of a generation raised on increasing stimulation. Hillenburg brought his scientific background, but the network and the writer's room brought the demands of commercial children's television, demanding absurdity, slapstick, and logic that bent entirely to the joke. The persistent theory that Bikini Bottom is the result of nuclear mutation is not a secret message planted by a lone creator. It is an unavoidable byproduct of a specific industrial and creative collision, Steven Hillenburg's biological realism clashing with Nickelodeon's mandate for absurdist cartoon logic, set against a geographic name that carries devastating real-world historical weight. The nuclear reading is not about intent, it is about what happens when a cartoon anchors itself, even accidentally, to a real site of American nuclear imperialism. To understand why this theory has such a grip, we have to break it down into 3 parts: the geography, the biology, and the demands of the network. First, the geography. The show is set in Bikini Bottom. The opening credits and numerous episodes, most notably the Season 2 episode Pressure, explicitly depict the characters living directly beneath a real island. That island is Bikini Atoll. In the real world, Bikini Atoll is part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, and between 1946 and 1958, the United States military conducted 23 nuclear tests there. The episode depicts this exact island. It is not a generic tropical backdrop. It is the specific atoll where the Castle Bravo test vaporized 3 islands and contaminated the region with fallout. By naming the city Bikini Bottom and placing it under that specific silhouette, the text establishes a geographic relationship to a nuclear test site. Hillenburg chose the name. Whether he was making a pun on the swimsuit or referencing the atoll, the name carries the history. Second, the biology. The characters are marine life behaving in deeply unnatural ways. A sponge filters feed and reproduces asexually. In the show, SpongeBob has a job, a pet, and a neurotic attachment to frying meat. A squid has 10 limbs and a complex nervous system. Squidward walks on 2 legs and plays the clarinet. These are biological impossibilities. The show routinely depicts extreme physical distortion. Characters are ripped apart, flattened, burned, and reassembled within seconds. This is standard cartoon physics, but in the context of Bikini Atoll, the pattern suggests a darker framework for those distortions. The radiation reading argues that these are not just cartoon gags, they are the exaggerated mutations of irradiated organisms. Third, the industrial reality. Steven Hillenburg stated in multiple interviews that the show was not about nuclear mutation. His original concept was rooted in educational marine biology. But the show that aired was not solely his. It was shaped by dozens of writers, showrunners, and network executives. The industrial context makes it likely that as the show progressed, the demands of Nickelodeon pushed the animation toward increasingly chaotic visual gags. Writers like Derek Drymon and Tim Hill needed to generate 11 minutes of escalating conflict. When you need a character to survive being crushed by an anchor for a laugh, nuclear mutation is not the stated premise, but it becomes the functional logic. The show's logic requires characters to survive extreme physical trauma, which aligns with mutation tropes, not because the writers intended a radiation allegory, but because the demands of gag-driven animation mimic the symptoms of radioactive mutation. So where does this leave us? The documented geography points directly to a nuclear test site. The biology of the characters is fundamentally broken. The industrial demands of the network required physical trauma to be played for comedy. The synthesis is clear: the nuclear theory persists because the show's own foundational elements, its name, its location, its physical logic, converge on a real historical trauma, even if no one in the writer's room intended it. You do not need a secret memo to make the connection. The name Bikini and the image of the atoll do that work on their own. But we have to be honest about the strongest counterargument. The Steelman case against this theory is simple: this is just a cartoon. Anthropomorphism is the oldest trick in animation. Bugs Bunny is not a radiation victim. Mickey Mouse is not the result of a lab experiment. Cartoon logic dictates that animals act like humans for the sake of comedy, and cartoon physics dictates that they survive physical trauma for the sake of a gag. The naming of Bikini Atoll could easily be a pun on the bikini swimsuit, which was itself named after the atoll in a misguided marketing ploy by its designer, who hoped the swimsuit would be as explosive as the bomb. Furthermore, there is no documented Layer 2 evidence, no writer's room notes, no network memos, no Hillenburg sketch, that confirms a nuclear premise. Hillenburg explicitly denied it. He was a marine biologist who wanted to make a show about the ocean. To claim that he secretly built the show around nuclear fallout is to ignore his documented background and his stated intent. This is where we need to separate what the creators intended from what the text produces. The primary counterargument correctly identifies that the mutations have a simpler, practical explanation: they are standard cartoon gags driven by the commercial need for visual comedy. But here is the critical gap. Even if the physical distortions are purely practical, the geographic anchor remains. The show explicitly places itself under Bikini Atoll. The denial of intent does not erase the text. The industrial context makes it likely that the writers and artists were thinking about puns and gags, not nuclear disaster, but they chose a name and a location that is inseparable from the atomic age. When Hillenburg named it Bikini Bottom, whether he was thinking of the swimsuit or the island, he invoked a place where the United States detonated weapons of mass destruction and displaced its indigenous population. You cannot use that name and show that island without awakening that history. The reading of the show as a nuclear allegory is not a conspiracy, it is a natural consequence of using a real-world trauma site as a backdrop for a comedy. If this thesis is correct, the implications are significant for how we understand the relationship between animation and the real world. Animation does not exist in a vacuum. It is built from the scraps of reality, names, places, biological forms, and when those scraps carry historical weight, that weight bleeds into the cartoon. What was possible to say in children's television at that moment was constrained by the need to be palatable, to sell toys, to make kids laugh. No one was going to make a children's show explicitly about nuclear testing. But the medium of animation, with its reliance on absurdity and its freedom from literal realism, allowed a space where the echoes of that history could resonate without ever being spoken. The creators did not intend a dark subtext. They built a comedy on top of a historical wound, and the audience, sensing the wound beneath the jokes, created the subtext themselves. The next time you watch an animated show, do not just ask what the creator secretly intended. Ask who made the decisions, under what constraints, and what real-world material they were drawing from, sometimes without even realizing it. Animation is a collaborative industrial product, but it is also a mirror. It reflects the anxieties and histories that we carry, even into the most innocent corners of our entertainment. The question the analysis opens is not whether SpongeBob is secretly about nuclear testing. The question is why we so desperately need it to be. What does it say about us, and about the history we inherit, that the most cheerful place under the sea can only exist in the shadow of a bomb?